Experts on the African continent have on numerous occasions called for an Africa free of borders. This, they believe, will be pushing the agenda of a one Africa reality with open borders, free movement of people, goods and services with a single currency and a single passport. However, this dream seems to be far away from reality. Research has shown that non-African visitors have found it easier to travel within Africa than Africans themselves. It can be up to 50% cheaper to fly from Africa to Europe than within the African continent. On the economic front, African countries turn to trade more with nations outside of the continent than with each other within the continent of Africa. These situations have sparked discussions about human mobility within the continent, highlighting factors like protectionism policies by African states that restrict travel. It should be underrated, or should not be underrated, that the continent is making progress towards a borderless Africa, inspired by the African Union's ideals to increase intra-continental trade and promote a freer movement of people, aiming to boost socio-economic and political development. Well, as of now, we have countries on the African continent that have restricted or implemented a visa-free requirements, so that is Seychelles, Benin, Gambia and Rwanda, in a bid to capitalize on the market of over 1.2 billion people to expand their economies. Today's topic of discussion centers around a borderless Africa pathway for integration. Ladies and gentlemen, you're welcome on board. Stay with us. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for trusting your Pan-African channel for you Media Africa. This day on this edition of Talking Points, we are focused on borderless Africa, of course, in a bit to comprehend how it would create a way or foster a path towards integration within the African continent. Of course, like we mentioned in our preamble, several countries on the African continent have been moving towards this agenda one of creating a borderless Africa, which includes the Seychelles, like we mentioned in our preamble, Rwanda, the Gambia meets other nations. Of course, it's worth noting that a borderless Africa is going to create a path for countries to be able to move freely, and as well the free movement of goods and services. To evoke this day, this topic of discussion, we've been joined by Dr. Stanley FONGOD, a Pan-Africanist. Greetings to you, sir, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for having me. I thank those who are viewing, watching us live on their streaming platforms, and those who will subsequently be watching this as well.
Absolutely, like you mentioned, we are streaming live on our social media platforms, Facebook and YouTube. And of course, you're watching us in your latest screens at home for you Media Africa. And of course, you're listening to us over the airways of FM 96.3. Today, there is a critical topic of discussion, one that is very important to the African people, especially at the time when Africa is striving to change the narrative within the African continent and head towards the economic growth and a development, one which could lead to integration. Dr. FONGOD, in your opinion, what do you understand by the term a borderless Africa?
We're talking about an Africa that mirror image what it used to be pre-colonial days. We are talking about an Africa where we're ruled by tribes and kingdoms and regions, rather than having individual separate nations, 50-something in number right now, depending on who you're talking to on the African continent. We are talking about an Africa that is free of the colonial era oppression, that is free from colonialism. We are talking about an Africa that is pre-colonial eras, and an Africa that is the Africa that was known to people like Mansa Musa. We are talking about the Africa that was known to the kingdoms of those in Kemet. We are talking about an Africa that was known to the kingdoms of those in Zimbabwe. So this is the Africa we are talking about, those in the Benin Empire, all right, the Malian Empire, the Ghanaian Empire. This is the Africa we are talking about. It's just literally making sure that we do away with all those borders, those pseudo borders that was placed on the continent of Africa, subdivided by a group of men out there in Europe, just so they could be able to, milk the continent the best way they knew how, and divide the continent like a plantation, which eventually it was, for the Europeans. So that's the kind of Africa we are talking about, a borderless Africa where there is freedom of movements of goods, services, and people.
Absolutely, a continent that is free in terms of movements for people, goods, and services. And now, Dr. FONGOD, you mentioned a very critical point. We had great men on the African continent. We saw great leaders, Pan-Africanists, I would like to term it that way. We saw in the person of Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, and you cited Mansa Musa, a host of others, Junior Nyerere, and a host of others. Why not Muammar Gaddafi of Libya? Now, all these great men actually had a dream about a unified continent, but a more unified continent is going to happen when there is a continent that is free from borders, one that does not consider itself divided. Now, in that light, what do you think are some of the challenges that have been hindering this possible dream of a borderless Africa?
I think that the first thing we need to fully do, and we're seeing this, outside of every economic, policies that can be able to help, but just from the political standpoint, we need to be able to make sure, that we have leaders on the African continent who will prioritize, a Pan-African agenda over their nation's sovereignty. I think that prioritizing Africa's unity is of great essence to the African. We have to find ways to make sure that our common agenda, that our minds are focused primarily on making sure that Africans unite, that we have to basically show up on an African front. And the good thing about having, a united Africa, a Pan-African agenda, is that we also help the Africans in the diaspora. If you have traveled outside of the continent of Africa, or even if you have traveled, especially going to areas like in the northern belt of the African continent, you will experience racism like you have never seen before. This has happened in the Americas, this is happening in Europe, all right, and even in some parts of Asia, where black people are treated still like animals, okay, like subhuman species or something. So we have to be able to build a robust front on the continent of Africa, a united Africa, so we can be able to speak for the black peoples that are scattered across the world. All right, so we have black indigenous populations in Asia, we have black indigenous populations in the America, and then likewise in places like Australia, the Aborigines. We need to be able to make sure that there is an African front that is strong enough to be able to defend, how be it on political basis, how be it on economic basis, to be able to defend the interests of the Africans that are in the diaspora. So a united, strong Africa is extremely crucial, is extremely important. It is something that we cannot, not have. So we must have the political will to be able to do so. I also think that we have to find ways in which we create some kind of a harmonization of policy. What that means is we need to be able to make sure that our policies mirror image each other from country to country when it comes to trade, when it comes to migration, when it comes to security, governance, so that in the event that we are trying to be able, to have that integration country by country, region by region, it will be easy for us to have this united Africa. I think that those are the things that we really must do. If you look at the country like Cameroon, for example, and you look at the country like Nigeria, I'm going to use that, for just to state this point further. If you look at the country like Nigeria, Nigeria has this federal system, and what that means is that they are decentralized in relationship to power, and that it is not just the central government does not have the full authority, so how be it on economic issues and on regional issues. So the federal systems allowed individual states to be able to govern themselves, and this brings for higher level of accountability. Reasons being the people in those particular states know exactly who to hold and who to accuse when things goes sour. So that structure is extremely very good when it comes to having a government that is actually for the people and by the people. In the unitary system which we have, which is in Cameroon, it's a little bit quite difficult because power is centralized. So if you're going to have some kind of a Pan-African agenda, it will be extremely quite difficult for a country like Cameroon to seamlessly integrate, across boards, looking at countries like Nigeria. We must find ways in which we bring about a federal structure across the continent of Africa, because actually what will work eventually will be a federal structure. A federal structure will be the Pan-African agenda, the Pan-African move. That is a Pan-African front. Well, we have completely decentralized systems, and we have countries that will now operate as states, and then it will be easy those states now to be able to govern their people, rather than having this unitary structure where power is concentrated and all the authorities is in the hands of the few. Its accountability is extremely quite difficult because you don't know who you're talking to. The structure becomes so massive, the government becomes too big. We need to reduce the size of the central government, decentralize that, and allow individual states, and this time, in the federal structure, to be able to make the decisions that affect the people in their region. I think that those are some of the things we need to look at, especially as we move forward with the idea of having, a Pan-African and a seamless continent.
Absolutely. Now, of course, you mentioned something about policies. I'll be coming back to that. But it's worth noting that before a continent actually gets to an external try reflecting how it can become a borderless, it needs to start looking at its internal structures to ensure that everything is in place for it to be able to get to that point. Because if everything indoors is okay, then it shall be able to represent itself outside. Now, Dr. FONGOD, you mentioned something about the importance of political will. How important is it for these, say, political will, as far as getting Africa to a point where it can be seamless, borderless, like you mentioned in your previous response?
Well, I think that, if we're going to be talking about having a system that is robust on the continent in relationship to, making sure that these international borders basically disappear, there has to be the political will. Reasons being, most of these countries are still, their point of reference is not Africa. Their point of reference is Europe. Their point of reference is the Americas. So these are countries on the continent of Africa whose first point of loyalty is not even to the African. Their first point of loyalty is to whoever is empowering them and basically keeping them in power. So if you look at most Francophone countries, except those boys in the Sahel who basically are taking matters into their own hands, in the past, it used to be that those boys, those countries were absolutely looking up to France. So France became their point of reference, and it was not even, another African country. And you can see this especially when it comes to migration. The data is extremely, available for a lot of people to look at. If you look at the rate at which most Africans leave Africa for Europe or the Americas, as opposed to leaving Africa for other African countries, those other African countries, and obviously it's for economic reasons, we get that, but those other African countries have never been a point of reference, even if they're doing better than the country in which they're in. They're looking at the country which they have believed, and they have been taught that those countries are quite better. And obviously those are developed nations like the Americas, like the United States of America, like Britain, or France, or those boys in Europe. So we have to be able to change that. The idea is, if we are going to be able to achieve this on a political front, we must be able to make sure that we get people into power who have a Pan-African agenda, people with a mind that rings Africa's first. all right? There has to be presidents that will bring into power that has the Africa First agenda. People who believe that everything has to be about the continent of Africa. And we also need to be able to make sure that we strengthen regional organizations like ECOWAS, like the Eastern African, bloc. We must be able to make sure we basically strengthen them, allow them to be able to experience somewhat of a Pan-African front, in economic terms, all right, monetary and physical policies, so that we will be able to look at these commodities and know precisely what we need to fix, what we need to adjust at, and how far we can be able to push this before we do something on a continental scale and then it blow up in our faces. So I think that those are some of the political will that we need to have to be able to achieve this. The reality is this: we will at some point fail in the process, but the failure is extremely very important to create the bonding and to create the unity that we want. There will be friction, but that friction is extremely very important if we're going to have a relationship long-term that fully works. There will be disappointment in many quarters, but that too is okay if we will be able to go back to where we were originally and to be able to have a continent that will be able to compete in the 21st century. We will need to be able to face these challenges. Well, are we going to have a smooth experience? Certainly not. But if the experience worth every dime, absolutely. We need to be able to make sure that we do whatever it takes on the political front. It might not be easy, and nobody said it was going to be easy in the first place, but it is worth every energy. It is worth every pain. It will be worth every sleepless night. We need to be able to achieve this. This is not an agenda that the African should not achieve. This is a unique agenda that the African must and will achieve.
Absolutely. And of course, Pan-Africanists like yourself have advocated that visa waivers, one passport, a single currency is going to go a long way in harnessing unity amongst Africans. In that same light, what are some of the hindrances to achieving this dream so it becomes a reality on the African continent? What has been pushing back the realization of a single currency and as well one African passport? Because we recall in 2000, the latest 2010, a single passport was supposed to have been released on the African continent, one that would be used to tour the African continent, but up to date, that is yet to be a reality. What are some of those loopholes, some of those things that are pushing back the realization of this project?
Well, I'm thinking that if we are not going to be able to achieve, that single passport, that Pan-African passport, maybe we just come out with a clear-cut agenda that if you are African, you are free to move on the African continent, without any visa. You are free to move to any African continent with zero restrictions. I wonder if those boys in the north will agree. The reason why those boys in the north, I'm talking about the Arab Belt, the reason for that obviously is because there will be a lot of African migrants that are moving out into those areas because they're trying to cross over through the Mediterranean into Europe. So obviously those boys will say, you know what, we don't want any part of this. That's fine. I think that those guys in the northern belt can, basically say, we don't want this, and that will be okay. There's a natural barrier that is there, and it is the reason for that natural barrier, which is the Sahara, that has act as a caution or a buffer, from a lot of young migrants, trying to be able to make it to Europe. Most still do through the Sahara, but it is not as much as if the Sahara was not in existence. So that being said, Sub-Saharan Africa must basically take the lead. I think that Sub-Saharan Africa, Black Africa, must make sure that there is no part of Sub-Saharan Africa where a Black African does not have access to. We should be able to make sure that committees like the ECOWAS do whatever it takes to make sure that if you are in West Africa, starting from Cameroon all the way to Senegal, you should be able to travel in and out of any of these countries in the western part of Africa with no visa restrictions. You should be able to go wherever you're going, irrespective of the passport you're carrying. But as long as you belong to the countries in this particular region, you should go wherever it takes. The reason why we need to be able to do this is because if we keep waiting that a day will come where all the chips will fall into place, all the stars will align in our favor, all the traffic lights will suddenly turn green, and then it says let's go, I think it will be extremely quite difficult. All the lights are never green, the stars will not all align, all right, and everything else will not be in place for us to do what we need to do. But we must start somewhere. So we need to start region by region, deal away with the issues of visa restrictions, at least for now, region by region, and then be able to adopt a common currency, maybe on a regional basis, or have a particular currency that superimpose itself over regional currencies. And for example, you can look at something like what is happening in Europe, which is basically the EU currency, the euro, all right, that superimposes itself, all right, over all the other currencies. And the reason why we are able to do that in the EU zone is because the monetary and physical policies of individual nations is in a simple shape with the euro and with one another, so that we do not go into a situation where the physical policies in one other country is so ugly that it affects another country, and then we start dealing with all kinds of issues of inflation. So I think that we really must be able to make sure that our physical and monetary policies in our individual nations mirror images other nations, so that we can be able to not talk about heavy issues of as inflation is concerned, and also the issues of exchange rate, which is one of the major reasons why a lot of companies find it extremely difficult trading with other countries. So we have to make sure that we work on this on a region by region basis.
Absolutely, like you started brilliantly in your preamble. It needs to start at the level of regions before it gets to a continental state. Now, you mentioned earlier on that if it's been done step by step, then Africa is actually headed in the right direction. In your words, now in that light, since you've already paved the way towards it, how would these foster a continent without border, foster unity and integration within the continent of Africa?
Obviously, we will be having a lot of mobility for people. So you will have professionals that will have the capacity to basically use their skill sets wherever the market needs them to be. I think that what we are doing is creating a free trade area on the continent of Africa once we begin to implement these policies. And what that means is we are getting people who are skilled, especially skilled workers, to be able to move, wherever the market is on the continent of Africa, so that they can be able to get the kind of money they need, for the services that they are rendering. That is extremely quite important. What that means is it limits the amount of flight, of human capital flight that takes place yearly from the continent of Africa as people move and migrate out of the continent. Most of those who are migrating are people who are looking for greener pastures, but the unfortunate thing is a lot of those looking for greener pastures are people we actually need on the continent of Africa. These are our doctors, these are our civil engineers, these are our nurses. And as they keep moving out of the continent and they keep moving out of our individual countries, we suffer. We train them, we send them to go work out of the continent. That is absolutely, not acceptable. We have to make sure that we invest heavily in these sectors, especially when it comes to the healthcare sector. We have to invest heavily in that sector so that we can be able to boost that sector up. And then in the long term, what that means is when the standard of care rises, so the standard of care goes up, the amount of money that medical doctors will be making and nurses will be making will also go up. And that means we'll have very limited amount of people trying to be able to exit the continent because they see how much money their counterparts are making out in the West. So we must be able to do this. I think it is extremely very important that once this integration begins to occur, we will be able to now allow the African to look on the continent and see what the market is. And also, we will be able to allow young Africans, do you understand that it's so easy for someone who is sick in Africa to travel to, to places like India for treatment when they can actually have the same level of care in places like South Africa? All right, they can have the same level of care in places like Egypt, but it is easier for them, and now Ghana is actually in the mix as well. But it's easy, Rwanda just got in also. It's easy for them to travel to places like India, not because there is something fantastic or phenomenon happening out there, it's just because it's that easy, all right? It's just that easy. And the Indians understand this, and obviously they are quite lax when it comes to the visa requirement, for someone who is coming out there for medical treatment. Obviously, when you come for medical treatment, just like if you come for tourism, you are spending money in that economy. You are bringing in money, you're helping their market. But unfortunately, on the African continent, we are specialized on the African continent in taking ourselves out. We don't even do tourism on the continent itself. If you ask the average African, where is Timbuktu? They're like, I don't even know where Timbuktu is. Maybe where is that? What Timbuktu? All right, do you know where Timbuktu is? No, I don't. If you ask an African, do you know where Zimbabwe, the Great Zimbabwe is? Yeah, know Zimbabwe, but do you know where the Great Zimbabwe is? No, I have no idea. If you ask an African, do you know anything about Kemet? Do you know what Kemet is? No. What is Kemet? Well, Kemet is ancient Egypt. No, I don't know Kemet. And the reason is because the African is not traveling. The Africans, notion about travel is all about, going out into the West. If you ask somebody on the African continent, where do you want to have your vacation? The first thing they tell you is New York, Los Angeles, I want to be in London, oh no, but what happens to all the other locations on the African continent? That brings me to the fact that, just like we said earlier on, it's extremely expensive for an African traveling, within Africa than traveling outside of Africa. That must stop. That must stop. We have to find ways to bring in a lot of competitors in the aviation space, bring in so many other carriers, so prices will drop and quality will go up. That's the beauty of having competition in the marketplace. That being said, if we're able to just put some of these things together, then we might be on the right track. Our trajectory might just look good.
And absolutely, competition paves the way for growth and possible development, like you mentioned. Beautiful, Dr. FONGOD. Now, just to reiterate, you are Pan-Africanist and an economist. Now, you earlier on said that policies do not accommodate this room for Africans to be able to harness this integration, or better still, does not pave a way for Africa to be able to get to a point of being borderless. Because first, in-house, the policies are somewhat not welcoming. And now, how do Africa address this problem of revamping its policies so it gets to suit and, of course, pave a way for growth, sustainable growth and development's possible integration in the African continent?
I think we have to achieve this sector by sector. So we must be able to find some kind of a harmonization within the agricultural sector. We must do so within the mining sector. We must do so when it comes to power. We have to do that when it comes to infrastructural development, roads construction, telecommunication. We need to be able to do that within those spaces. The reason why that is important is because these are the vehicles that we will need to have, especially as we begin to implement, these policies and framework that will push us together as we exit, these borders and basically decimate them, completely wipe them off of the map, and let there just be a united Africa. The borders might stay, but not as international borders, but as state borders, or federal borders, not state borders rather. They might stay as state borders, and I use the word state because it's extremely quite difficult for most Africans to understand state borders, especially when we live in countries where there are no states. So in the federal systems, we have states, and these states, for example, in Cameroon, we have the northwest regions, southwest regions. Those become states. So we have the southwest state, the northwest state, and then we have the eastern state or the south state. So we have borders, all right? So the northwest and the southwest regions, for example, have their own borders. So if you're in Nigeria, you're in Lagos state, or you're coming from Akwa Ibom state, those have their own individual borders. Now, if we're able to make sure that we seamlessly work with the, so that we can have some kind of a seamless integration, we need to work with specific areas, and we need to go to make sure we tackle them. For example, take something like education. I think that education is extremely very important on the continent of Africa, but there's a lot that we can do as we move forward. If you look at education, if we build up our educational structure to have an accredited system that have a unitary front on the continent of Africa, that means that everyone on the continent of Africa is tied into that particular curriculum. What that means is, if somebody graduated from a school in Nigeria and that person is a medical doctor, somebody who is in the Gambias would have absolutely no issues questioning if the person actually graduated or if the person had the quality of education that they have in the Gambias. The reason is because the accrediting body has already certified, what the curriculum is, and everybody adheres to these stringent, rules that all the schools will come into. And then they need to also have an exit exam or a board exam that cut across the continent, so that by the time you actually pass that exam, you're good to work anywhere else on the continent of Africa. Once we allow freedom of people, freedom of goods and services, the market would decide exactly what the market will decide, which will be that the market will pay, all right, for goods and services that they deem fit, goods and services that the market wants. If we allow for a free market, allow for people to be able to move, and the only way we have a free market is when goods and services would actually be allowed to move across those so-called international boundaries. But if goods and services and people are not allowed to move, then the market is quite restrictive. Imagine that there's a medical doctor which is very good, at operating something like, let's say, breast cancer, in Lagos. And this doctor is known, all right? There's newspaper articles about him. He's done great. The amount of people who have recovered and who are living as a result of his work, speaks for itself. And then there are people in the country, I don't want to shade any country, but, maybe a place like Morocco, for example. All right. So a place like Morocco, and Morocco, there are just no very good medical doctors in Morocco, when it comes to breast cancer. But there's someone in Lagos that has a skill set that is really good. It is important for that person who is in Lagos to be able to travel, all right, to places like Morocco to carry out this surgery. It happens in developed nations every day. It happens in America every day. So why is it not that we can be able to bless the people and allow the people on the continent of Africa to have access to these people, have access to their skill sets, have access to what they have to offer, and actually save lives? Once we allow people to move on the continent of Africa, once we allow goods and services to move, then it's not just that we have achieved, a free trade area, but it is that we have actually improved the quality of life of those on the continent. That is something that we must and should do.
Absolutely, you have cited that borderless or seamless Africa is going to benefit the continent in terms of health, in terms of economic, in terms of politics, political gains, and other aspects in the B2 of foster growth and development on the continent and possible integration. Now, Dr. FONGOD, you said something else which I would like to capitalize on. In our preamble, we mentioned the fact that through the African Union's ideal plan of an African continent of free trade agreements or area, it's possible, or it would be possible, to have a borderless Africa, the free movement of people, goods, and services within the continent. In that regard, towards a borderless Africa, how would this bloc, how would this project, how can the African continent leverage the potentials of the African continent of free trade area for the benefit, or say in terms of economic growth, in terms of developments, and possible integration within Africa?
There's a lot that Africa will gain, if we have just a free trade area. We talk about goods and services. You look at companies that are operating in places like Ghana, small to medium-sized enterprises in places like Ghana, in places like the Ivory Coast, they will be able to sell their goods and, their goods and, services in different parts of the continent of Africa, and then what that means is that those parts will also experience whatever it is that those boys in Cote d'Ivoire, those boys in Ghana are doing. It will boost up the market in Cote d'Ivoire, it will boost up the market in Ivory Coast. Likewise, it will also boost up the market to where these goods and services are going, because there'll be distributors in those areas, they'll be sold in stores in those areas, or whatever will be the channel to which it is that these goods and services are being sold, and that also will bring money. Those countries will also be able to have to benefit from some kind of taxation on those goods if they want to, but depending on the type of goods, so that local market might also be able to compete as well. Because while we are talking about this, we also have to make sure that we understand that goods and services is good. We have to move goods and services, but we must also make sure that we do that in a responsible manner, so that local markets can be able to breathe. If you, for example, take a big time producer of cocoa in a place like Cameroon, and then we are trying to ship cocoa, or maybe forget Cameroon, take Ivory Coast, leading producer in the world. So if you take Ivory Coast, for example, and you're trying to see how Ivory Coast can be able to supply cocoa, let's say there is somebody who is now decided, who have enough sense on the continent of Africa to mass produce, chocolate, for the continent, and so they're importing cocoa from Ivory Coast. Let's say that factory is in Cameroon. It will be important to make sure that whatever is coming from Ivory Coast do not destroy the market of the farmers who are in Cameroon who are farming cocoa. So if we don't understand this and be able to put up frameworks that will allow for goods and services to move responsibly, that will also become an issue in the long run. So those are some of the issues why a lot of African countries are kind of slow on the issues of the Pan-African front when it comes to the free trade area. But this is important. I think that what we are afraid of in the end, it's not good, because what we're doing is we are trying to ginger the market. We are trying to be able to make the market work, and you cannot make the market work. You have to allow the market to do what the market does. We live in the free market environment. This is what capitalism is all about. People will go for whatever is cheap and is good. So they're looking for two things: how cheap it is and how good it is. That's what they're looking for. And the only way you can get what is cheap and what is good at the same time, if there are many competitors in the market, because these companies will be competing for your goods and services. So they want to give you at the best price possible, and basically also gives you the best quality possible. If you look in the country, for example, like Cameroon, you have very limited people operating in the telecom sector. So a company like MTN can say whatever he wants to say, do whatever he wants to do. You have different companies that are out there that are trying to come in to bring us data, but these companies are fighting, putting all kinds of legal framework just to be able to block, foreign companies from coming in and operating in the data space. But the truth of the matter is, we need to have competition. All right, we need competition, because once we have competition, you will notice eventually that the speed that we are currently, used to will just miraculously, go up. You realize that whatever these boys were doing, stifling millions, out of the average Cameroonian because they're providing them data, that nonsense would stop, and everybody will now begin to enjoy just a wonderful time as it relates to good internet speed, and also and connectivity at the same time, where we have good speed, we have constant connectivity to the internet, and this will help the local market. There are folks also in Cameroon who are sitting in Cameroon who has multinational jobs. They work for corporations outside of the continent. They need internet, they need to be connected. That's the only way to work. They need the internet access. We need to be able to make sure that at least in the tech space, we do whatever it takes to make sure everyone on the continent is somewhat connected. We need this. There has to be, this framework in place. Otherwise, it will be one issue, one roadblock here, one roadblock there. But if we start small, if we start block by block, not in relationship to ECOWAS and whatnot, I'm talking about spaces rather, let's say in the agricultural sector, you know, in the educational sector, if you look at in the telecom sector, if we just begin to target these particular sectors and allow it to be seamless across the continent, eventually it will be very easy for us to put the regulatory framework and, you know, where all of us will come together to understand exactly what we need to do, how we need to do it, because we see this there, we've understand this is affecting this market. We now have a data to say that this is what is happening when this happened, because right now, you know, anybody can say whatever they want to say. We have no data supporting anything. Everything is head knowledge. We need concrete data. It's only when we have those concrete data we can be able to run analysis on it.
Yeah, absolutely, and of course that's the need for data centers on the African continent for us to concretize all this potential which the African continent has. I recall an article actually shows that a country like Rwanda in the year 2023 had a 43% boost in its economic growth as a result of exports of minerals in the East African nation. Looking at a little country like Rwanda and look at the African continent, which many a times is been regarded as a continent that is minimal rich, as a continent that is filled with potential. Now, Dr. FONGOD, how can the African continent, when we're talking about integration, we're talking about a country that is headed towards economic growth and development, how can Africa actually capitalize on the potentials it has? Because we're looking at it to be able to get what it has, garner the potentials, the mineral rich resources which it gets in a bid to foresight on growth and development. So when you look at a nation like Rwanda, what lessons can the African continent and what can we say Africa needs to do to capitalize and gain more control over its resources, so it definitely leads to its own expansion?
In the most crude way, I think Rwanda just told herself she will not be raped anymore, right? That she will not be raped anymore. The continent of Africa is constantly being raped daily. You know, by Europeans, it's being raped daily by Americans. The Chinese are not doing better. They are raping the countries in which you cannot believe. A couple of days ago, I was talking with someone in the eastern part of Cameroon in a place called Beti. Beti is a frontier city between Cameroon and the Central African Republic. It's a place I have been many times. I spent 6 months of my life, you know, living in that area. And I was there basically understanding the mining sector and what was going on. There is a river in that location called the Bombay. You cross that river before you get into Central African Republic. That river is disappearing. The reason why the river is disappearing is because there is a Chinese firm that is operating just upstream. That river was teeming with fish and shrimps and a lot of things in that river. It was healthy, but now the Chinese company came, and because of this illegal practice of mining that is taking place on the African continent, they are dumping toxic waste and all the waters that they use in washing gold, which is laced with mercury, because that's how gold is actually being purified, you know, at the artisan level. They are destroying the river. The river is dying. My friend walked to that river with tears in his eyes to show me what was happening in the river. Unfortunately, we are being raped daily. So the Cameroon government can sit and beat its chest and can sit and think about, you know, the responsibility that they have to the Cameroonians. The Cameroon government has absolutely zero responsibility to the Cameroonian. They have not proven at all that the interests of the black man, the African, supersede the interests of the Chinese. The Cameroonian who is in authority does not care. He does not care because he does not believe that that has any impact on him. But generations to come, young Cameroonians will begin to die from cancer and all kinds of issues because of the irresponsible mining practices that we have on the continent, that we have in Cameroon. It's a shame. I'm even ashamed to talk about this. I'm so ashamed to talk about what's happening in Cameroon because that's the country of my birth.
Absolutely.
And so you can understand that
recall,
it's not just Cameroon, it's everywhere else.
Yeah, I recall some leaders in Nigeria, so to say, neighboring Nigeria, had actually, especially in the northeast part of the country, had put in place measures to be able to curb these illegal mining practices. And it's not just in Nigeria, we're seeing this in other countries across the continent. Recently, we saw Namibia, for instance, that there was the discovery of the world's largest diamond. But aside all this, how can Africa capitalize on its own potentials for its own growth?
If we stop allowing the West to be able to tell us what to do and continually and constantly ripping the continent of its natural resources, if we stop, folks coming in from the East or the West to mine the continent illegally and take out of the continent what we need to be able to build the continent, then I believe, like those boys in Rwanda, they are doing what, most African countries are not doing. Just so in context, if you look at Rwanda basically has nothing so far as natural minerals are concerned. They have nothing. Just go up northstream in relationship to a place like the DRC. What is happening in Rwanda is child's play. The DRC is the mother lode of them all. But the DRC is at war, designed as a construct of the West. Why? Because we can fly in and fly out, with our private jets and carry what we are carrying and leave the country with nobody asking any questions, and that is what's happening in that place till date. I have friends in places like Goma that will not sleep in their homes because of the constant fighting. 127 different militia groups, most of which are sponsored by Western corporations, and they're operating in these areas, and so much for the world talking about the fact of equity, equality, and all that garbage are here coming out of Washington, D.C. The truth is, while we are blaming everybody else, what the Africans need is a mirror. I think the day we basically stand in front of that mirror and tell ourselves, enough is enough, this nonsense will not happen, that's the day that Africa will rise. That's the day that we will basically gain our consciousness. And I think that's the only way we put an end to this. The African must be able to stand before a mirror and look into that mirror and see the one person he hasn't blamed yet, the one person who is responsible to change the status quo, the one person with the power and the ability to say no is the person he's looking at in the mirror.
Absolutely. For Africa to be able to change things within its own continent, within its home, there needs to be a change of mindset. And of course, in that regard, a change of mindset that Dr. FONGOD would determine or will have to start with the young, so they have to grow up in that light. Now, I recall that we mentioned this in a couple of editions, that Africa needs to revisit its roots. Like you mentioned, if you have to ask someone about Kemet, they might likely not know what it's all about. But then when Africa, given Africa is headed towards integration, Africa is headed towards greatness and prosperity, how can the continent, or can we say that getting back to its history, consulting its history, knowing back its culture, intensifying its culture and preserving it is going to go a long way in realizing this dream of a borderless and, of course, a continent full with integrity?
Absolutely. If we get young people to begin to understand that what is good is not what is from the West, that what is in vogue, or what is it that it's, will make them feel better about themselves, is not what they watch on BET or some Western news channel. That the history of the African is extremely very important for them to understand why we fight to have a Pan-African front, that the continent never used to be the way it is right now. That the reason why the continent is this way is what the Europeans did on the continent of Africa that pushed the continent, and what slavery and colonization did that basically stalled and stunted the growth of the African. So if they understand that and understand the great civilizations that were on the continent of Africa, it will build their psyche. We will be having strong Pan-African who will be indoctrinated, and I use the word seriously and precisely with a lot of intention, that they will be indoctrinated with the vision of Pan-Africanism, which which is one indoctrination I permit, that every young African must think Africa first. I believe that we should not have any young person graduating out of our university if that person has not been taught the history of the African from an Afrocentric perspective. I also believe that our school system should not have people who do not understand the history of the continent, teaching our young people European history and American history and Asian history when the history of the African has not been taught to the African. This is the level of brainwashing we need to be able to distance ourselves from the African continent. The young people, this is the future of the African. This is the future of Africa. If we are ever going to be able to emancipate this continent, we must be able to get these young people into work right now. If not, it will be extremely very difficult for us to talk about getting young people to stand and fight for a Pan-African front. We have to do it now. We must be able to get them into that frame of mind where they see Africa first and they see Africa's historic past and the glory in Africa's historic past.
Absolutely, given that the dream of a borderless Africa is going to benefit the continent in several aspects. Dr. FONGOD, you mentioned looking at the security situation of the motherland Africa. When you look at it, especially you mentioned a country like the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is reeling from turmoil, and we have other countries on the continent like Sudan, Libya, and a host of others. When you look at these countries, could we say amplifying the dream of a borderless continent go a long way in ensuring that we have an end to these security crises which Africa is facing? Because if we have integration, then definitely we're going to have what we'll call unity.
Obviously, if the EU was going to flood, places like the DRC with soldiers and literally disarmed, militia groups, either they just abandon and move somewhere else, hopefully not within the continent of Africa, that would be good. The fact that we still sit here, while militia groups are doing whatever they're doing the beating of the West, it's not as if to say they're actually even doing anything for the interest of the African or someone of the Congolese. They are not doing it for those in the DRC. They are doing it primarily, for Western corporations and those who are sponsoring them from outside of the continent. We have to put an end to this. So if we have a Pan-African front, if we have a united Africa, that madness will stop immediately. I mean, immediately. While we are talking about this, we also need to get the Organization for African Unity, which is the EU, to stand and fight at the levels of the United Nations, corporations like Apple, corporations like Samsung, these multinational corporations that are too big, all right, to fail, that does whatever they want to do anywhere in the world with absolutely no recourse. We have to be able to fight that. That is extremely very important. If not, I think things will be a little bit difficult for us to be able to, to achieve that level of freedom we're looking for on the African continent.
So, since we're gradually coming to the end, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. FONGOD, in your perspective, what suggestions can you request to the African continent? Because an African adage thus goes that a united house cannot stand, and a divided house cannot stand, I beg your pardon. Now, with these concept in mind, I remember a young child has once said that if you hold a broom while it is in a bundle, an African broom to be precise, you will notice that you cannot easily break it apart. But once it's divided, once it is in shreds, it actually is easy to break. Now, using that to define the African continent, Dr. FONGOD, what suggestions can you make? Because would you agree with me that it's actually feasible for the realization of a united continent? And what can Africans do to head towards that part?
Absolutely. So in the Americas, right here in the United States, not far from where I am, just probably about 100 miles from here, there are these foxes that will come and will befriend dogs. And what they will do is that they will become friends with the dog. all right? And so this particular fox will come and become friends with the dog, and then they will be, playing and moving around. What the fox objective is to take the dog far away from the home, to take the dog just somewhere a little bit further into an ambush. Once it gets into the ambush, the fox's friend shows up from behind the bushes and then just basically kill and eat the poor little dog. That's what happened to the African. The West is specialized at literally isolating, different African countries so that we do not have a unitary front on anything. None of our legal policies, none of our regulatory framework is united on the continent of Africa, primarily because of the influence of the West, America, and England, France, all of those nations. They will do whatever it takes to make sure that there is no united front. We must be able to elect leaders who are willing to die for the continent. We must elect leaders who believe that the African is far more important than anything that can be coming out of Washington, D.C. Excuse me. I think this is extremely very important. If not, we will always be what we have always been, and nothing will change. To change tomorrow means we change today. To enjoy the tomorrow that we want means we believe in what is it that will be the best course of action for the African continent, not our own individual achievements, not the amount of money we're making, not the promise to have a mansion in Beverly Hills, not the promise to have a mansion in the Hamptons, not the promise to be in Buckingham Palace. We're talking about a promise to be with your ancestors in places like Timbuktu, the promise to be with your ancestors in places like the valleys of the kings. We must do whatever it takes to make sure that the vision of the African is Afrocentric in nature. It is not Eurocentric.
Absolutely, and just a few words, Dr. FONGOD. Now, given that Africa is actually headed towards what we call renaissance, or actually headed towards its own definition, one I'll call actually headed to its own freedom, Dr. FONGOD, in your own words, given a young African that is getting into understanding that Africa needs to get to a point where it's towards its own liberation, in the words, or say the words of a Pan-Africanist to an African man, what would you say?
I would say do whatever it takes to become everything you're supposed to be. Fight, study, read, just embellish yourself with everything that is Pan-African. Look at the history of some of those great who have come before us, men like Julius Nyerere, people like Kwame Nkrumah, people like Patrice Lumumba. Look at their work. Read some of those folks in the Western world that came and also did great stuff to bring about a Pan-African agenda. You just have to be able to look at the civil rights also that came as a result of people like Martin Luther in the United States. Look at those movements, see who the key players were, and understand that the vision for a united Africa is as old as anything else, is older than even the colonial era. We have to be able to make sure that we are united on the continent so that we can become the help that the African in the diaspora needs. That's the vision for a united Africa. That's a Pan-African vision. We are going to make sure that Africa is for Africans at home and abroad.
Africa needs to be Africa for Africans within the continent and Africans abroad. Thank you immensely, Dr. Stanley FONGOD, for your brilliant insight in the course of today's edition of the Doctorum. Ladies and gentlemen, we were discussing this day a borderless African continent, meanwhile highlighting the role this would play in integration within Africa. And of course, our guest had highlighted that there is this need for the Mbutu spirit within Africans for Africa to actually flourish and of course get to a point where it can see real from economic growth, real from development and possible integration. And he equally mentioned that there is a need for Africans to revisit their education systems, while highlighting that it's imperative for the continent to value its own culture, one that will lead to possible integration and much more unity within Africa. Of course, it's worth noting that while we discuss this topic of discussion, discussion, the feasibility of a united Africa is actually possible, ladies and gentlemen, and why we strive to have a borderless Africa, is what noting that Africans need to stand for one another. Africans, whether in Ghana, whether in Nigeria, whether in Cameroon, whether in the Gambia, whether in whatever part of the continent you may be finding yourself, or where you may find yourself, ladies and gentlemen, you have a role to play. And of course, the youth have a role to play, the media has a role to play, each and everyone has a role to play as far as creating a borderless and seamless Africa is concerned. Ladies and gentlemen, it's on that note that we shall be drawing down the curtains of today's edition of Talking Points over your Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. Meanwhile, I've been NJIX and NABESEH for presentation. We say thank you for your keen attention. We were watching, or you were watching us on For You Media Africa, your television, of course, listening to us over the airways of FM 96.3. I'll leave you in company of the numerous transmissions over your Pan-African channel. Bye-bye.